When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in December 1991, the world watched a superpower vanish overnight. 15 new nations emerged from the rubble of the Iron Curtain. But while we often think of the USSR's end as a single event, the reality on the ground was far more complex. For some of these republics, the end of Moscow's rule was a moment of pure liberation, a chance to escape a prison they'd fought against for decades. For others, it was a tragedy, a catastrophe that shattered their economy and their sense of identity. We're going to rank every single former Soviet republic based on one simple metric: how much they liked or loathed being part of the USSR. If you want to find the place where the Soviet Union faced its fiercest resistance, you have to look at Lithuania. This small Baltic nation earns the absolute lowest score on our fondness scale. They've built their entire modern national identity on the rejection of it. The hatred started the moment the Red Army arrived. When the Soviets annexed Lithuania in 1940, the locals retreated into the woods and started a war. These were the Forest Brothers, a massive partisan movement of nearly 50,000 fighters who waged a brutal guerrilla campaign against Soviet troops for almost a decade. They lived in underground bunkers, ambushed military convoys, and fought to the death rather than surrender. The Soviet response was devastating. Moscow deported over 100,000 Lithuanians to Siberia and killed thousands more to break the insurgency. If you want a further deep dive into the topic, check out our video here. That trauma never really healed. Even after the guns went silent in the 1950s, the resistance just changed shape. The Catholic Church became a fortress of dissent. Priests ran underground networks, publishing secret chronicles of human rights abuses right under the nose of the KGB. This boiling tension exploded in the late 1980s. Lithuania became the tip of the spear for the breakup of the entire Soviet Union. They were the first republic to formally declare independence in March 1990, a full year before the actual collapse. Moscow tried to crush them one last time. In January 1991, Soviet tanks rolled into Vilnius and stormed the TV tower. 14 unarmed civilians died that night standing in front of armored vehicles. But the crackdown backfired. Instead of scaring the population into submission, it galvanized them. Today, Lithuania treats the Soviet era as a criminal occupation. They converted the old KGB headquarters in Vilnius into a museum of occupations and freedom fighters. Visitors can walk through the actual torture cells and execution chambers used by the Soviet secret police. The government has banned Soviet symbols alongside Nazi ones, and they actively prosecute former Soviet officials for genocide. If you ask the average Lithuanian today if they miss the good old days, the answer is almost statistically zero. They fought the hardest to leave, and they've never looked back. Just north of Lithuania lies Estonia, another Baltic state that shares the top spot for anti-Soviet sentiment. While their resistance might have looked different on the surface, the underlying hatred for the occupation runs just as deep. Estonia lost a massive chunk of its population during the war and the subsequent Stalinist terror. The Soviets deported tens of thousands of Estonians to the gulags, targeting the country's intellectual and political elite. In their place, Moscow moved in hundreds of thousands of Russian speakers to work in factories, aiming to dilute the local culture. By the 1980s, Estonians felt like an endangered species in their own capital city. But the Estonians found a unique weapon to fight back: music. This was the singing revolution. In the late 1980s, hundreds of thousands of people gathered in festival grounds to sing forbidden national songs. It sounds gentle, sure, but in a totalitarian state, it was a radical act of defiance. This culminated in the Baltic Way in August 1989, where 2 million people from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania held hands to form a human chain that stretched 600 kilometers across all three countries. They turned their backs to Moscow and demanded their freedom. Since gaining independence, Estonia has ruthlessly purged the Soviet legacy from its streets. They tore down the bronze statues of Lenin and dismantled the Soviet war monuments that dominated their city squares. The most famous of which happened in 2007 when the government moved a Soviet war memorial called the Bronze Soldier from the center of Tallinn to a military cemetery. The decision sparked massive cyber attacks from Russia and riots by local Russian speakers, but the Estonian government stood firm. For them, that soldier represented the beginning of a 50-year nightmare. Modern Estonia has pivoted harder to the West than almost any other post-Soviet state. They're a digital powerhouse, a key NATO member, and a country where the younger generation speaks English rather than Russian. The state education system teaches the Soviet period as an illegal occupation. Latvia sits right between its Baltic neighbors, and it shares their intense dislike for the Soviet past. However, the situation here is slightly more complicated due to demographics. The Soviet Russification policy was most effective in Latvia. By the time the Union collapsed, ethnic Latvians barely made up half of the population in their own country. This demographic reality created a deep-seated anxiety that defines their politics today. Like Estonia and Lithuania, Latvia fought a bloody partisan war in the 1940s. The Soviet secret police hunted down Latvian nationalists with ruthless efficiency, culminating in the mass deportations of 1949. In a single operation, Moscow loaded over 40,000 people into cattle cars and shipped them to Siberia. This decimated the rural population and broke the back of the armed resistance. But the memory of that terror fueled the independence movement 40 years later. When the Soviet Union began to crack, Latvians built barricades in the narrow streets of Riga to protect their parliament from Soviet special forces. People camped out in the freezing winter, guarding their new government with nothing but bonfires and sheer will. When Soviet troops opened fire in January 1991, killing 5 people, it cemented the USSR as a hostile foreign power in the eyes of the Latvian public. After independence, Latvia took drastic measures to secure its identity. They passed strict citizenship laws that denied automatic citizenship to people who moved there during the Soviet occupation. This created a large class of non-citizens, mostly ethnic Russians, who had to pass language and history tests to get a passport. The government viewed this as a necessary step to undo the colonization attempts of the previous decades. In 2022, the government demolished the massive Victory Monument in Riga, a towering concrete spire that served as the focal point for Soviet nostalgia. For years, the Russian-speaking minority gathered there on Victory Day, while ethnic Latvians viewed it as a symbol of their subjugation. Watching that spire crash into a pond was a cathartic moment for the Latvian majority. While the country still has a large Russian minority that remembers the Soviet era fondly, the state itself is unapologetically anti-Soviet. Now we move away from the Baltics to Central Asia, to one of the most bizarre and isolated nations on Earth, Turkmenistan. This country earns a high ranking on the hater scale, but not because of a democratic revolution or a fight for human rights. Turkmenistan rejected the Soviet legacy by replacing it with something even more controlling. For most of the 20th century, Turkmenistan was a quiet, cotton-producing republic on the fringes of the empire. But when the Soviet Union fell, the local communist leader, Saparmurat Niyazov, executed a masterclass in rebranding. He declared himself Turkmenbashi, the father of all Turkmen. Niyazov wanted to erase the Russian influence entirely to build his own personal cult. He banned the Cyrillic alphabet and switched the country to Latin script. He renamed the months of the year after himself and his mother. He ordered the dismantling of Lenin statues, replacing them with golden statues of himself, with some rotating to always face the sun. Niyazov declared a policy of permanent neutrality, effectively shutting the door on any post-Soviet military alliances. He pulled the country out of the Russian orbit and turned it into a hermit kingdom. Soviet history books were thrown out and replaced by Runama, a spiritual guidebook written by Niyazov himself that every citizen was forced to memorize. The average citizen in Turkmenistan simply traded one authoritarian system for another. But from a geopolitical perspective, Turkmenistan severed its ties with the Soviet legacy outright. There's almost no public nostalgia for the USSR here because the state has monopolized every inch of the cultural space, with the Soviet era treated as a mere footnote to the glorious era of the Turkmenbashi. Returning to the Caucasus Mountains, we find Georgia. This republic has a complicated relationship with the USSR, primarily because the man who built the modern Soviet superpower, Joseph Stalin, was Georgian. But don't let that fool you. Georgia ranks firmly among the haters because their experience with Moscow was defined by crushed rebellions and bloody crackdowns. Georgia's resentment goes back to the very beginning. The Red Army forcibly annexed a fiercely independent Georgia in 1921. Even though Stalin was one of their own, his purges decimated the Georgian intelligentsia. But the turning point for modern Georgia came on April 9th, 1989. On that day, thousands of peaceful protesters gathered in the capital, Tbilisi, to demand independence. Soviet troops moved in to clear the square. They used sharpened shovels and poison gas against the crowd. 20 people were killed, mostly young women. That massacre broke the psychological bond between Georgia and Moscow forever. 2 years later, on the anniversary of that tragedy, Georgia declared its independence. The relationship only got worse from there. In the 1990s and again in 2008, Georgia fought wars against Russian-backed separatists in the regions of Abkhazia and South Ossetia. For Georgians, these conflicts were a continuation of Soviet imperial tactics. The 2008 war, where Russian tanks rolled deep into Georgian territory, solidified Russia and the Soviet legacy as an existential threat. Today, Georgia is aggressively trying to integrate with the West. They fly the European Union flag outside their parliament building, even though they aren't members yet. They opened a museum of Soviet occupation in Tbilisi to document the political terror of the communist years. While there is a sliver of the older generation that still respects Stalin as a strongman, his hometown of Gori even kept a statue of him for years, the overwhelming national sentiment is anti-Soviet. They view the USSR as the empire that promised them brotherhood but delivered occupied territories and broken treaties. If there's one country that defines the tragic complexity of Soviet legacy, it's Ukraine. For decades, Ukraine was the second most important republic in the Union, the industrial powerhouse, the breadbasket, and a source of countless Soviet leaders. But it was also the site of the USSR's greatest crime. In the early 1930s, Joseph Stalin engineered a famine that starved millions of Ukrainians to death in a land famous for its fertile black soil. It was a deliberate attempt to break the Ukrainian peasantry. This genocide is a cornerstone of Ukrainian identity today, a permanent scar that marks the Soviet Union as an executioner. For years after 1991, Western Ukraine viewed the USSR as an occupation, while the industrial East and South remembered it as a golden age of manufacturing and status. Millions of Ukrainians served in the Red Army. For a long time, the country was politically paralyzed between these two memories. That paralysis ended in 2014 and then definitively in 2022. When Russian tanks crossed the border flying Soviet victory flags, the debate ended. Ukraine embarked on a decommunization, a massive legal purge of the past. They renamed thousands of streets and tore down over 1,000 Lenin statues in a phenomenon dubbed Leninfall. Today, Ukraine is a nation at war with the Soviet legacy, which is reincarnated in the form of Russian aggression. But we rank them in the middle historically because, unlike the Baltics, it took them 30 years and a brutal invasion to fully exorcise the ghost. Moldova is the definition of an identity crisis. It's a small nation wedged between Romania and Ukraine that has spent its entire independent existence trying to figure out what it actually is. The Soviets created modern Moldova by carving it out of Romania in 1940. They imposed a Cyrillic alphabet on Latin-speaking people and tried to construct a new Moldovan identity separate from their Romanian roots. This social engineering created a deep schism that exists to this day. On one side, you have the pro-European Moldovans who view 1940 as a brutal annexation. They remember the deportations of the intelligentsia and the forced famine. On the other side, you have a massive segment of the population that misses the Soviet markets. Moldovan wine and tobacco fueled the USSR, and in return, the Republic got cheap gas and stability. When the Union collapsed, Moldova became one of the poorest countries in Europe. That economic trauma fuels a powerful nostalgia. It's why the Communist Party remained a major political force here well into the 2000s, winning fair democratic elections. But the ultimate symbol of this division is Transnistria. This is a thin sliver of land on the eastern border that literally refused to leave the Soviet Union. When Moldova declared independence, Transnistria fought a war to stay aligned with Moscow. Today, it's a breakaway state that doesn't officially exist, a living museum of the USSR. They still use the hammer and sickle on their flag, and a statue of Lenin still guards their parliament. If you want to travel back in time to 1980, you go to Tiraspol. Moldova is quite literally a country cut in two, one half marching toward Brussels and the EU, and the other half frozen in Soviet amber. Cross the Black Sea to the oil-rich Caspian coast, and you find Azerbaijan. This republic offers a different flavor of mixed feelings, a combination of intense grievance and cynical pragmatism. Azerbaijan's hatred is focused on a single bloody date, January 20th, 1990. They call it Black January. As the Soviet Union was unraveling, nationalist protests erupted in the capital, Baku. Moscow's response was brutal. Soviet tanks smashed through barricades and rolled over cars, firing indiscriminately into apartments. Over 130 civilians were killed. That night killed the Soviet idea in Azerbaijan. It turned loyal communists into nationalists overnight and is remembered today as a crime against humanity. In 1992, Azerbaijan elected the fiery anti-Soviet nationalist Abulfaz Elchibey, who wanted to sever all ties with Russia. It didn't last. Just 1 year later, a military coup toppled his government, and the country swerved back into the hands of a man who knew the Soviet system better than anyone, Haidar Aliyev. Aliyev was the son of a Soviet titan, a former KGB general and member of the Politburo who had run Soviet Azerbaijan for decades. He himself was a product of the Soviet elite, and he led the government in curating a very specific memory of the past. They condemn the crackdown of 1990 as a Russian crime, but they celebrate the stability and economic modernization of the Soviet years because that's the era Aliyev built. Azerbaijanis are pragmatic. They switched their alphabet to Latin to align with Turkey, distancing themselves from Russia culturally, but the state kept the secular, centralized, and authoritarian style of governance reminiscent of the USSR. In Central Asia, Uzbekistan presents the most complex case. This was the most populous republic in the region, the heart of the Soviet Muslim world. The hatred here stems from cotton. Moscow turned Uzbekistan into a plantation. The central planners demanded endless quotas of white gold, forcing millions of people, including children, into the fields every harvest. To water these crops, the Soviets drained the rivers that fed the Aral Sea. The result was one of the world's worst environmental catastrophes. The Aral Sea, once the fourth largest lake in the world, practically vanished, leaving behind a toxic desert and a sick population. Uzbeks view this as colonial abuse, pure and simple. They also remember the cotton affair of the 1980s, when Moscow sent investigators to purge the Uzbek leadership for corruption. While the corruption was real, Uzbeks felt singled out and humiliated by their Russian overlords. But when the USSR fell, chaos followed. Uzbekistan's neighbor, Tajikistan, plunged into a horrific civil war. Afghanistan to the south was a black hole of violence. In comparison, the Soviet era looked like a time of peace and safety. The post-independence leader, Islam Karimov, ruled with an iron fist that was essentially Soviet in style. He maintained the control, the secret police, and the secularism of the old regime. For many older Uzbeks, the Soviet Union meant development. It meant Tashkent becoming a modern city with a metro system and universities. It meant electricity in the villages. While the government today promotes a nationalist history centered on Tamerlane and the Silk Road, they haven't erased the Soviet past entirely. They've just quietly repurposed it. While Uzbekistan resent the environmental rape of their country, they miss the predictability of the empire. In the mountains of Central Asia, Tajikistan earns a high fondness score because of the nightmare that followed the end of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union dissolved, Tajikistan fell into a brutal civil war that lasted 5 years and killed tens of thousands of people. The infrastructure collapsed and the economy disintegrated. For a generation of Tajiks, the Soviet era is remembered through the lens of that trauma. They look back at the 1970s and 1980s as a golden age of peace, electricity, and subsidized bread. The Soviet Union brought literacy and medicine to a region that had very little of either. It transformed remote mountain villages into functioning parts of a modern state. Today, Tajikistan remains economically dependent on Russia, with a huge portion of its GDP coming from remittances sent by migrant workers in Moscow. The cultural and economic umbilical cord was never really cut. For the average Tajik, the USSR represents a time when they didn't have to leave their families just to feed them. Next door is Kyrgyzstan, another nation that views the Soviet legacy with pragmatic gratitude. Before the Bolsheviks arrived, the Kyrgyz were a largely nomadic people. The Soviets forced them to settle, which was a painful and sometimes violent process, but it also brought rapid modernization that many Kyrgyz today value highly. Kyrgyzstan stands out because it doesn't have the intense anti-colonial narrative you see elsewhere. They kept the statues of Lenin in their provincial towns out of respect for the education and industrialization he represented. In the capital, Bishkek, the architecture and the layout are proudly Soviet. Like Tajikistan, their nostalgia is fueled by economics. The collapse of the Soviet Union destroyed their manufacturing base. The love here is less about ideology and more about the simple fact that life was more predictable under Moscow's watch. They were the pragmatic loyalists. They didn't ask for independence, and when it came, many wondered if it was a mistake. Moving to the Caucasus, Armenia offers a completely different reason for loving the USSR: survival. Armenia sits in a terrifying neighborhood, sandwiched between historical enemies. After the genocide of 1915, the tiny Armenian Republic was on the brink of total annihilation. Then, the Red Army arrived. For Armenians, the Soviet takeover was a security guarantee. The USSR shielded them from Turkey and allowed the survivors to rebuild their culture and nationhood in safety. During the Soviet years, Armenia thrived. It became a hub for high-tech research and science. Yerevan transformed into a beautiful pink stone city of jazz cafes and intellectuals. While Armenians were furious with Moscow in the late 80s for not supporting them in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, that anger never morphed into a hatred of the Soviet system itself. Today, Armenia remains one of Russia's closest allies, hosting Russian military bases to guard its borders. The memory of the Soviet Union is tied to the idea of protection. They know that without the Russian umbrella, their history might have ended in 1920. Kazakhstan is the giant of Central Asia, and its relationship with the USSR is a masterclass in diplomacy. Kazakhstan was the laboratory of the Soviet Union. It was where they tested their nuclear weapons, and it was where they launched humanity into space from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Kazakhstan was the last republic to declare independence. They literally stayed in the Union after Russia itself had left. Their longtime leader, Nursultan Nazarbayev, built a modern identity that embraced the Soviet past rather than rejecting it. He framed Kazakhstan as the place where Soviet dreams were realized. They celebrate the fact that Gagarin flew from their soil. They value the Russian language as a tool of business and science. Kazakhstan views the Soviet era as a difficult but necessary modernization that turned them from a steppe society into an industrial power. If you want to see what the Soviet Union might have looked like if it survived into the 21st century, go to Belarus. This country is the closest thing to a Soviet theme park you can find. Belarus suffered more than any other republic during World War II, losing a quarter of its population. The Soviet victory is the sacred foundation of their national identity. They view themselves as the heroic partisan republic that held the line against fascism. Under President Alexander Lukashenko, Belarus kept the Soviet flag with a minor tweak, kept the state-controlled economy, and even kept the name of its secret police, the KGB. They never did the shock therapy capitalism that impoverished their neighbors. As a result, many older Belarusians feel they avoided the chaos of the 1990s. They look at the USSR with pure affection because, in many ways, they never really left it. Finally, we reach the core: the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. For Russia, the USSR was them. They were the center of the empire, the language of the realm, and the face of the superpower. The collapse of 1991 was a crushing psychological blow. President Vladimir Putin famously called it the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century, and millions of Russians agree. They don't necessarily miss the breadlines or the censorship, but they miss the respect. They miss being one of the two poles of the world. The 1990s in Russia was a decade of humiliation, poverty, and gangsterism. The Soviet era, in retrospect, looks like a time of glory when they defeated Hitler and sent the first man to space. Today, the Russian state has revived the Soviet national anthem, rebuilt the military parades, and actively encourages nostalgia for the great victory. While there is a liberal minority that remembers the gulags and the repression, the dominant cultural mood is one of loss. They loved the Union because the Union was their claim to greatness.